A ceasefire agreement has been reached today on the 15th of January between Israel and Hamas. This comes after a 15-month-long war. We'll find out what's next, what this means for the region, and geopolitical risks overall around the world that investors need to be paying attention to this year. Joining us to discuss this is Pyotr Kurzin, host of the Global Gambit podcast. You can find him on YouTube and his social media links down below. Welcome back to the show, Pyotr. Always good to see you.
Thanks, David. Happy New Year to you and everyone. There's a lot going on at the moment.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you as well. Some good news coming out of the Gaza Strip. Israel-Hamas reached Gaza ceasefire deal in 15-month war. Mediators say it comes more than 15 months into a deadly campaign. The deal, not yet formally announced, outlines a 6-week initial ceasefire phase and includes the gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and release of hostages held by Hamas in exchange for Palestinian detainees held by Israel. An official briefed on the negotiations told Reuters. Well, the Israeli cabinet still needs to approve the ceasefire, but a step in the direction of peace. What's your initial reaction to this news? Breaking story, it's still developing.
Yeah, I would say from the outset that at the time of recording, this has only been sort of aired really about 45 minutes ago. So it's incredibly difficult to know exactly what the details are. But this is something that has been in the pipeline for largely a year. The Israelis and the Hamas entity have been in negotiations in multiple rounds, if you like, but they've often reached sort of an impasse, either because of one blaming the other and vice versa. Entities like the U.S., Qatar have been trying very hard to sort of broker this. You can make comments or suspicions about the vested interests of any said third party, but this is what remains to be seen is whether or not this is a ceasefire that will be comprehensive, i.e. it has the capacity to last more than a few weeks, or is a sort of temporary one, and whether or not one party decides to breach it. Right, you might remember that we heard of humanitarian pauses at some point early on last year, and that was sort of as an attempt to build a foundation by which to lead to what maybe this seems to be, which is a more comprehensive actual ceasefire. Whether or not that leads to an armistice and actual peace deal, very largely not. But we can dig into a little bit more of the potential repercussions from this.
We will just a bit. Is the timing of this ceasefire agreement aligned with the inauguration of Donald Trump in just a couple of days, actually, Pyotr? He did say several times over the last couple of months that he wants Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end the war on day one of his inauguration. I wonder if there's a coincidence here or this is aligned.
So, yeah, I mean, first I'd caveat that I know some of your viewers have been critical of some of my perspectives in the past, and I would just say that sometimes what I say isn't necessarily what I think. There's a difference between, what I prefer versus the reality of the situation. And I think when it comes to Trump, that is very applicable because you have the Trump effect, right? He is inevitably going to have an influence on things, even if he isn't yet necessarily in the position to physically make the decisions, enact policy, and so on. But certainly, there's a lot of flurry in capitals around the world to prepare and try to, win round Trump. And I don't think Israel's any different. Both sides are aware that Trump's going to come in very heavily handed in terms of what he is willing to provide Israel with to get the job done. I think he's been quoted to say, and also to Hamas, who well, they might not admit it, but he's a pretty hawkish chap. So I think in this regard, he hasn't physically had necessarily any influence. That's not how diplomacy works. It's Biden's representatives, diplomats on the ground, political appointees. Blinken is the one who's flying around the Middle East trying to engage different parties, not necessarily Marco Rubio yet. But that doesn't negate the fact that Trump certainly has an influence. And I think Bibi Netanyahu, bottom line, I would say he wants to be in good stead with Trump because at the end of the day, this builds into Trump's broader grand strategy in the Middle East, which is Iran. Trump wants to focus on decapitating or severely incapacitating Iran even more than they already are, arguably. And therefore, Bibi, I think, wants to be freed up of this Gaza situation to an extent. But it's, again, a lot of this is speculation, so it's hard to tell.
So how is this ceasefire going to affect the Israeli-Iranian relationship going forward, do you think?
I think that I don't know how much the ceasefire itself is going to play much into the strategical rivalry, or not their lack of, between Israel and Iran at this point. Whether people support Iran or Israel, the reality is that Iran has had a lot of setbacks in the past half a year since I last spoke to you. You know, we've seen an entire nation state completely change its leadership, whether or not, again, from foreign interference or not. HTS now leads the helm of Syria, not Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad was a huge point of a key point for the Islamic Republic in what's known as the Shia Crescent, which sort of spans from Lebanon down through Iraq to Iran and such. And so the loss of him and their desire for sort of more of a secular state is certainly a setback. Whether or not that benefits Israel 100%, it's not clear. Israel's still obviously gone into southern Syria and occupies more of it beyond the Golan Heights. But Iran also has, a very incapacitated Hezbollah. They're still a potent force with the number of missiles that they have and such. And Hamas hasn't been fully eradicated. They are still there in remnants. And you've got other things like the PIJ, which is a smaller sort of offshoot Islamic jihadist group and such. So the relationship between those two, I don't think it's going to be mainly determined by the ceasefire, as I think it is the Trump administration. How Trump seeks to engage Israel and how they collectively then seek to engage Tehran, I think will be more indicative of the Israeli-Iranian relationship than the ceasefire itself.
Okay. This is what's being reported in the news. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump confirmed that a deal has been reached to release hostages in Gaza. Phase one of the deal, which will span 42 days, will include the release of 33 Israeli hostages, including all women, children, and men over 50. Negotiations on implementing the second phase will begin by the 16th day of phase one, and it is expected to include the release of all remaining hostages. What's next after that? The report did indicate that the IDF will begin phasing out military presence in the Gaza Strip. What does that look like to you, you think?
Well, it's difficult because each conflict zone has its own set of parameters that you have to consider, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a conflict. You have to talk about humanitarian provisions and establishing, causeways, thoroughfares by which to provide said aid. Israel and Palestine is arguably the most complicated because there's so many non-state actors. There's so many other elements. It's not just a nation state to nation state sort of approach. And then you've also got longer term post-war reconstruction. Who's going to fund the rebuilding of Gaza? What parameters, what preconditions are going to be in place before that can even begin? But firstly, very generically speaking, you would have aid being provided by certain, be them regional bodies or nation states themselves. Egypt's obviously going to be incredibly instrumental in this. One of their airfields quite near the Rafah border or Rafah crossing, which you remember is on the southwestern flank of Gaza, will be one of the main points by which aid comes through. But obviously, this also has to be all done also under supervision, under inspection, to make sure that the aid isn't being squandered or looted or just stolen by remnants of Hamas or whoever to fuel a resurgence or something. So you're going to see the UN probably in there, but that's going to be tough because of the Israelis' opposition to UNRWA. You've got probably the Arab League will be important. European nations, maybe through humanitarian bodies, will be present as well as observers. So you've got a hell of a load of sort of a spider's web of different entities all trying to coordinate, and this could make it actually more complicated. But we're seeing Gazan Palestinians celebrate, so hopefully they can begin to receive some kind of aid, and then we can begin to talk about what a post conflict situation looks like, which very quickly would involve, discussions with, Hamas is obviously not going to be part of that. Israel doesn't want that, but it's whether or not the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is the predominant administrator of the West Bank, can be sort of trusted enough or brought back into the fray, and some kind of thorough, governance model exists. But that's going to obviously be, again, involving Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey probably wants to be involved as the sort of regional hegemon or they consider themselves, and then obviously the United States. So the we're very early days, and all of this could become undermined if either side thinks that they've been cheated, and we go back to conflict.
What's the path to de-escalation in the Middle East overall come inauguration day?
Well, it depends who you ask, I think. If you ask the White House or incoming White House, they'll say Iran. If you ask many other nations, they'll say Israel. If you ask other people, they'll say nothing. The Middle East, based on its existing nation state boundaries, is never going to be at peace because it's a mesh of different groups claiming land which was arbitrarily cut up by the British and others, in the 20th century. So long-term Middle Eastern peace is unfortunate, a little bit of a pipe dream. You're always going to see, countries that are interested in provoking others, foreign interference, different groups vying for power. I mean, I think if Syria could, and I'm going out on a whim here, obviously, if Syria could be a basis by which can we trust the former part of Al Qaeda to be a genuine person who wants to see secularism exist in Syria, well, then that would be an absolutely, great day. He apparently, according to some articles I've read, he is getting more hardline members of the HTS militia to not remove Christian, entities, emblems, and artifacts, and so on, and to encourage secularism in that way. Lebanon has obviously managed to do this, but it's a much smaller country and has had the support of France and foreign investment for a longer period. So Syria is now on the rebuild. But if Syria can get a standing, a foundation, then maybe, I think an improvement in the relations with Iran is obviously integral. They are, whether or not people like it, important in the region, and their influence in Iraq, which can still be a hotbed for tension and instability, is also a consideration. But I think short to medium term, establishment of a Israeli-Saudi relationship, possible recognition of Israel by Syria, a more moderate version of Iran. But obviously, if you get a more hardline Iran, which seeks to get a nuclear weapon, already has that, we don't fully know, and that antagonizes Washington, well, then you've got an escalation. So I would say largely Iran, but there are many other components of which I've laid out.
Good. All right. Well, other geopolitical hotspots around the world. Let's talk about U.S.-China relations going forward. It doesn't seem like tensions are dying down before inauguration. If anything, the opposite, as Trump has um, has doubled down on his trade war rhetoric. What's next for China and U.S.?
Yeah, well, I think that depends a lot. Again, a large proportion of it is going to be on Trump. Trump, in my opinion, quite simply has made his foreign policy China. He doesn't really want to get too involved in the Middle East if he doesn't have to. He wants Israel, he wants that to be sort of largely sorted, as we've touched upon. Russia, Ukraine, which if we come to, I think he wants that obviously to be severely, maybe not completely resolved, but largely sort of changed, stabilized. And I think when it comes to economic policy, there's no denying that there are Americans who feel the pinch or challenges over the US economy. But relative to China, job growth is pretty good, inflation is stabilized, production seems quite high, productivity seems quite high. So from China's perspective, they have a intensifying pension dilemma. The CCP are facing a lot of issues over that, economic mismanagement, and what have we seen? A $1.4 trillion fiscal package announced in December, and the loosening of the money supply to try and boost consumer confidence spending, which is super low right now. And then obviously there's the impending trade war. The Chinese know that Trump seeks to set a base tariff of what, 60%, 200% in some cases relative to, say, EVs or electronic vehicles. These are not things that are going to benefit the Chinese economy, but more broadly, it's not going to benefit, I think, the whole global economy, which is looking fragile, shall we say, with all the hotspots, flashpoints around the world. And I think that the if the strategic competition between the Chinese and the Americans really gets intensified, right? We're talking way worse than what we saw in 2018 when Trump first initiated all this. It's gonna be bad. Some people reckon it could be a global recession kind of potential triggering point. There's your thumbnail title. I'm pretty sure Trump is hawkish, but he's also protectionist at the same time. And these policies could be problematic for the US economy as well. I'm not going to say suddenly that Trump's going to create terrible conditions for Americans, but tariffs, if you know any basic economics, don't tend to do the best for any economy. They are quite simplistic, slap-on methods of toolkits which don't necessarily benefit anyone. But Trump wants to bring home more industry. He wants to friendshore. He wants to reshore, nearshore, and I think that these things are understandable, and we could see that playing out across the globe in many different ways as we go into 2025.
Is there a broader political movement, a new zeitgeist, if you will, going on right now? The French government collapsed earlier last summer. Basically landslide win for the Republicans at the last election. UK Prime Minister polls falling. What's going on, Piotr?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest political risks, geopolitical risks
Not
I've,
to mention Canada, by the way. Trudeau just resigned. So, yeah, unhappiness here as
sorry, I
well. But
don't.
I'll
Well,
let you comment on that.
Canada's the state, didn't you know, David? Canada's part of the US. It's the 51st state. It's not a nation state, so it doesn't matter. Um, and Look, I think I put this out in one of my videos, the five main geopolitical risks of this year, right? These
Yeah.
are larger themes that I think will be prevailing. And we've mentioned one in Trumponomics and strategic competition with US, with China. But when it comes, this is political violence and political polarization, right? We have a potential where the US is bickering with NATO allies about Greenland, whether or not you support Greater America or America First is a separate matter. This is a problem for economic policy, for supply chains, for basic, trade. It's a problem, and I think what's going on is that we're seeing a great amount of people who are fed up, disenfranchised, got a bit of taste in the mouth about the establishment. But what's interesting is that it's clear that the populist, if you want to use that word, isn't all set. I'm thinking of Elon Musk is very critical of Nigel Farage suddenly because he doesn't support Tommy Robinson. So even populists like Nigel Farage have resistance with other, shall we say, anti-establishment supporters like Musk. So it's not all clear cut and dry. I think the best example, which we can use as a, shall we say, reference point in the coming month or so, is the German election. The German election is a snap election, but Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor, has been very, well, I'm frustrated with him personally as hell. He's been very in sort of inconsistent, a fence sitter, and I want someone who at least makes decisions. But the interesting thing is, Musk attempts to, shall we say, influence the German election by hosting an AfD candidate may not have benefited her as much as possible. A lot of people who are pro AfD support, who are pro AfD, have said that they weren't overly sold by her personality. So sometimes less is more in terms of public appearance and PR. Most likely, you're going to see the CDU win, which is still an establishment party, as in its centre right, it's the Christian Democrats, but they've shifted to the right. Much like the Conservatives in the UK in the past few years have shifted to the right. They're no longer in the centre sort of. So what you're seeing is a growth of what's known as the horseshoe theory, right? So you've got both sides, the fringes are growing in support, and therefore the more centerline parties are having to pivot slightly to the left or to the right to pander to those electorates. The Spanish have done it with their recent announcement of the house supply issue. Pedro Sanchez has, shifted to the left over that. So I think what you're going to see is incumbent parties doubling down in more adopting a clearer sort of not centre position, but just right or left to try and win back some of that favour amongst fringe parties. But it depends a lot on the context of the specific country. Germany is a coalition, and no party is going to get involved with the AfD versus in the UK where it's a bit different. So I would also add one last point, which is obviously social media. I've already alluded to it, but the role of Musk, whether you like him or you don't, is very powerful. And his calls for a election in the UK less than 6 months after we've just had one is, well, that's not how the politics in the UK works. I'm not a fan of Starmer's government. I've already had enough of them. I think they're very unwilling to take risks or make the right decisions. And so maybe the continued pressure by social media will force governments to start actually making political choices, decisions based on that, policy decisions based on that, which you can say is a good thing, but also a scary one because it means governments are being forced by big tech, or so it's a slippery slope. But I definitely think you're seeing an intensification of political extremes or fringes in this year.
So if you could, let's finish off here. If you could narrow down one or two things, events or developments that investors need to be watching this year, what would they be? These events would have the most significant impact on market action, in your opinion.
Well, I think the biggest geopolitical risk is, and again, it's not necessarily a critique, or the biggest risk slash
Mm.
opportunity is Trump. Trump's relationship to China as a subset of that. The strategic competition of the two biggest economies and militaries affects everybody else, regardless. This isn't the Cold War. It's not a hot war, but this is what one analyst called a managed decline of the relations between Beijing and Washington. So I think that is an overarching theme that will affect, commodities to supply chains to agriculture to raw minerals like metals and such, obviously given China. But also the other thing I would watch is Ukraine, Russia. We haven't touched upon it today, but Putin has come out with more maximalist demands this time around. But what's interesting, on the other hand, is Trump has made it clear that actually his 24, 48-hour promise of a resolution is not likely to happen, probably in the first 100 days, to quote General Kellogg, his appointee, to sort of get the two talking. And now you've actually got a bidding war between Serbia and Switzerland, a couple of others, I think, to host these two. But the point is that I would watch that. There is certainly, I think, going to be a ceasefire at some point of some form at this point, but it depends on the details. Trump is not going to want to be cheated or feel like he's being messed around by Putin. Putin knows not to probably do that, but also he is obsessed with Ukraine. He wants to get what he thinks he deserves, he needs for the Russian people, and therefore he's putting forward that he wants Ukraine not in NATO, guaranteed, which I personally agree with, but also that Ukraine is severely demilitarized, which he's not going to get. Because in the eyes of the Europeans and possibly parts of Washington, the Pentagon, they're not going to see that as anything but Russians wanting to then try and militarize and do this again. I'm not saying whether or not that's going to happen, but that's their perspective. And then the other thing I would say is a bit of a wild card, Syria.
Mm.
Turkey is obviously working quite hard to be the regional hegemon in that area. We've seen them with Azerbaijan and Armenia, but now with Bashar al-Assad gone, that is a huge potential for Turkey to put through a major pipeline and other energy interests in that sub-region in the Levant. So you could see a huge rise in sort of potential oil and gas dynamics down there as well. So yeah, just a few things. And then obviously, I mean, we mentioned it again, but do watch the political violence or just, unpredictabilities. Because as we saw political developments from Bangladesh resulting in a new leadership to the UK, which is considered to be usually a place of political stability and a good place to put your money. And look at the state of borrowing and the gilt market at the moment in the UK. It's not good. So yeah, quite a lot of things, but maybe we can reconvene to cover more things in the coming months.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Peter. Appreciate your time. Where can we find your work and your channel?
You can find me on YouTube at my name, Pyotr Kurzin / Global Geopolitics. You can find me on Twitter at pkurzin, and you can find me on Blue Sky or anything. It's usually just my name. If you just type Pyotr Kurzin into Google, you'll find all sorts of things,
You've made it.
including
We can
previous.
just Google you and find you. That's
I need a
everyone's dream.
Wikipedia page.
All right. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Richard's got a great channel, so we'll link it down below. Make sure to check out the Global Gambit there. We'll speak again next time, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.